This is a special edition podcast for Veterans Day. In this podcast, we'll hear from a couple of our volunteers who also served in the armed forces. They'll tell us a little bit about their service, what they've experienced serving in the armed forces, and then also about the research they're doing for this project. Super excited. You're listening to the Stories Behind the Stars podcast. My name is Tatiana Fallon, and I'm your host. This podcast is run by the organization Stories Behind the Stars. This has nothing to do with Hollywood. We are telling the stories behind the stars that were given in World War II. For those of you who are not familiar, during World War II, when a service member was killed, the family received a banner with a gold star on it. We are telling the stories behind these stars. Our goal is to put them all 400,000 into a common database, which then we will build a smartphone app that will be searchable from any location where you can read the story behind the star and you can really come to know the individual that died on D-Day and fought for our freedoms. This podcast is dedicated to telling those stories as we find them, as our researchers are doing this amazing research. You'll hear from researchers who are all volunteers from all across the country, and you'll hear their story, what brought them to the project, and then also the stories that they're finding. This is amazing content, and I really hope you enjoy this adventure. The first person I interview in this podcast is Dennis Dupras. He's an absolute amazing wealth of knowledge. So awesome to be able to talk to him, and I hope you're excited to hear his amazing story of his service and some stories he's been finding along his journey.
My name is Dennis V. Dupras. I currently reside in Anchorage, Alaska.
Can you tell us a little bit about your time in the service?
Yeah, I was in the Army. I enlisted in the Army in October of 1988, and I enlisted in New Jersey, of all places, about a block away from my grandmother's house. And I enlisted and became a airborne infantryman, a paratrooper, and I was assigned to Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 325th Airborne Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And I served as an enlisted soldier, paratrooper, for almost 4 years, about 3 years, 3 years and 4 months. While I was in the 82nd, I was from 1988 to 1992, 1988 to 1992. I got out as an E4 specialist. I was in the 82nd during Panama. I didn't go to Panama. My unit didn't rotate, but I went to the first Gulf War and I served in the first Gulf War. I was there. I was on the third plane, about the third or fourth plane to land when they decided to send troops. I was there for all of Desert Shield and all of Desert Storm to the end, and we came back in March. I was an infantry guy. I carried, and as an infantry guy who does the fighting, we were in the desert, and there were different plans and that went on. When we first got there, we went up to the border to defend Saudi Arabia. We were near the Kuwaiti border, and then we rotated off the border, and then we went out west, out in the western desert. And when the ground war started, they assigned my division, my brigade, to the far left with the French army. So we invaded western Iraq with the French 6th Blondie, the 6th Blondie, the 6th French Light Armor Division. So we went north with them on our left, and we did about 72 hours of operations. There was a little fighting here and there before the ground war started on the border with the Iraqis, and then we went north and there was 2 towns. I can't remember their name, one town, and this other big ridgeline we took. And then there was a ceasefire, and then we came back. And then after that, I was in the 82nd still. And then I got an early out to go back to school. I was in college previously, and I was at the Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, Virginia. And VMI is a different type of place for most people who don't know it. It's been around since 1839. It's got a lot of history. And I finished my rat year. That's what they call freshman there. And I finished my rat year, and which is an accomplishment in and of itself. Going to VMI is kind of like going to Ranger School, Marine Corps Basic, and your first year of college all thrown into one. It's a good time for those who can survive. And I failed calculus and chemistry with equal dexterity, and that's one of the reasons I wound up enlisted. And after the first Gulf War, they let me basically VMI kind of wrote me a letter, and I had to take some courses in summer school, but I was readmitted after my enlisted tour. And then I was in the Virginia Army National Guard in the 116th Infantry, Virginia Infantry. And for some of the people who I know write these stories that are familiar with the 116th, they were in the first wave at Normandy, along with the 16th, the 1st Infantry Division. They're the guys you see in the newsreels and in Saving Private Ryan with the blue and the gray and blue circle on their helmets. They took the big casualties. The Bedford Boys were the 116th. So that regiment has a long history. Fought in World War I as well. Goes all the way through the Civil War to all the way to the American Revolution. And while I was there, I eventually got commissioned, and then I got sent up here to Alaska. And I was an infantry platoon leader in Alaska with the regular Army at the 17th Infantry. Was a platoon leader, did some times as an assistant operations officer, and did some other things. And then I got out, and I worked for the state of Alaska. I still do. And eventually I joined the National Guard, and I served in the National Guard up here. And I deployed as an officer, as an infantry officer, to Iraq to 2006 through 2007. And I was embedded as a military advisor to a foreign military contingent in Iraq, to the Mongolian Armed Forces. So there were 2 Alaskans and 100 plus Mongolians in southern Iraq. So you could tell who the Alaskans were. They picked us out pretty easily. And I was in the Army, and then I came back. I stayed from the Guard for a while, and then my work was a little too much for my job and my family in that regard, so I got out of the Guard. But I have probably 13 years of service.
So then what brought you to writing stories of fallen World War II?
Well, I heard your Don talking on a podcast about this, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. And I've always had a large interest in World War II and military history in general. My degree at VMI is in history, and my concentration was on military history and some other things, but mostly military history. Emailed him, and that's how I got started. I kind of specialize. Everybody has different interests, and a lot of people, it's about where they live, which makes sense. And that's kind of similar to, I guess, me. I write about Alaska, and then I write about the Battle of Attu a lot, casualties from the Battle of Attu for the U.S. 7th Infantry Division, because I have a list of all the guys who were killed from that unit, from that battle. And I do the fallen from VMI, from World War II as well. And I occasionally do some guys from the 82nd, because I was in the 82nd, and I'll write some stories about them.
So do you have specific stories today that you could share with us?
There's a couple. Well, there's one. It's kind of got a veteran connection in a way. This guy's name is William Lander Eiler, and he was known as Buddy. And I came across him on Facebook on a thing about the Aleutians, and it was actually a woman had commented, my uncle died in the Aleutians, and I just messaged her, what was his name? And I looked, and I found his name in my list, and she sent me a photo of him, a really nice photo. And most of these guys from 7th ID, I don't have photos from. And I wrote his biography or his memorial. He served in the 17th. He was in the anti-armor company for the regiment, which means he manned a 37 millimeter anti-tank gun, which was kind of puny by 1943 against the Germans, but served very well against the Japanese, taking out positions or tanks. And he served throughout the campaign, manning one of those guns, pushing them up. And they were the 37s in Attu were very good because the Japanese were engaging us at long range uphill. And you could use them to snipe at the Japanese or fire a high explosive round. And they used them to take out Japanese positions from a distance, from a safer distance. And he fought all the way up across a place called Clevisy Pass, which is named after another officer who was killed. from Massacre Bay into we call it now, it's called Savannah Valley, and eventually into a place called Jimfish Valley, which is named after another colonel who was killed, who was from Alaska himself too. And he was killed on May 29th, or they have the date, it's May 29th or May 30th. He's maybe to the 30th, and he died of wounds, but he was most likely he was a KA or wounded on the 29th when the banzai charge occurred. His unit was on the floor around what is now near Chichagof Harbor, which would have been the old Attu village. And that's where the Japanese were penned up at the end. And it wasn't the first banzai charge, but it was the first entire garrison banzai charge that occurred in the Pacific. And the remaining survivors of the garrison, there was really a garrison of 2,000. They're not sure. They think it was over 400, maybe 500. Basically broke into a banzai charge at 3:30 at night. They overran. One company had been reserved most of the battle and was somebody made a mistake, and these guys had gone back to eat chow before the final action, and they overtook the guys manning the line fairly quickly. And then they hit another company in the 17th that overran them, and they got isolated, so that the guys on the next company that got hit, they got isolated into small pockets of firepower if they weren't killed, and they kept charging, overran basically regimental headquarters, killed a couple colonels, battalion staff, and they were finally stopped by some engineers at the top of Clevacy Pass. So it's not a battle that's really well known today. It's and the 17th and the 32nd Infantries both have one battalion left on active service. 17th, they're at Fort Lewis right now. They come under the 2nd Infantry Division currently. And the 32nd come under the 10th Mountain Division, their battalion, the remaining battalion in New York, Fort Drum. But they are the last two U.S. Army units to see active action on the American continent. So that's kind of a unique thing.
That's big. I mean, that's really, because when you're talking about this, I did not know that there was a banzai attack on American soil. You hear about them, on the Japanese islands of Okinawa, but you don't hear, that's not something that you learn about. But that's big news.
When people think banzai charge, the classic example is if you watch the Pacific is a great example at the Tenarue River. That is I guess a good dramatic representation of one. I've never experienced one, thankfully, but from what I've read and studied, Saipan was a huge one. It was a very large one at Saipan.
So this man that you're telling us about, what's his name again?
His name is William Lander Eiler. He was from Ohio. He was known as Buddy. He actually wound up living with his sister. His parents had died, and he grew up around his sisters, and everybody knew him as Buddy. And the woman who I was communicating with, and her name is Wendy Fleming. She's a veteran herself. She served at Fort Bragg at the same time I did. She wasn't in division, but she was an air defense artillery officer. She was captain, and that's kind of why I threw this story out there, because it's veteran connected. And they were always very proud of Buddy, and I guess the sister mourned his death to the day she died. So, and he was unmarried and had no children when he died, which most of the guys are.
Well, it's been such a pleasure having you on here again and just listening to your service and your stories. And it's just always so much fun to learn from you. I love it. It's I love learning about these things and just realizing what I don't know is just really inspiring.
I guess for me, I try to meld the history side with the personal side. So, maybe young people and other people can see that they're connected to this. That those soldiers or that WAC, they're not much different than you in many ways. They're really not that much different from you. They're trying to find their way in the world. It was a less technologically complicated world then, but how do I put this? Humans are still humans. They still have the same issues. The positives and the negatives are still there.
I love listening to Dennis. He does an amazing job with all of his research and such a joy to listen to. Tune in next week for part 2 of this episode where we interview another veteran. Bob Joyce. It's a super awesome interview, and subscribe to the podcast so that you can get a notification when that episode goes live.